Okay, let's dive right into this explainer by challenging a core assumption you probably hold about yourself. And that is the idea that you're a highly logical, calculating creature. I mean, we all like to think that when we make decisions, whether it's buying a house, choosing a career, or honestly just picking what to eat for lunch, we're weighing the facts with the precision of a supercomputer, right? Well, the reality is far messier and honestly infinitely more fascinating. Today, we're setting the stage to explore the groundbreaking research of psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. Their work on human decision-making completely revolutionized our understanding of the mind, fundamentally proving that our brains are actually wired with predictable glitches. Here is our quick roadmap for today. 1. Two speeds of thought. 2. Mental shortcuts and biases. 3. Understanding prospect theory. 4. The two selves. And 5. The replication crisis. Let's jump into Section 1, Two Speeds of Thought, the protagonists in your head. Think of System 1 as your brain's autopilot. It is fast, it's automatic, it's running all the time, and it is highly emotional. When you instantly recoil in disgust at a gruesome image, or when you effortlessly solve 2 plus 2, that's System 1 in action. It literally jumps to conclusions with effortless speed. On the flip side, we have System 2. This is your deliberate, calculating supervisor. You're using System 2 when you're trying to parallel park in a really tight space, or if I asked you right now to multiply 17 by 24. You can actually feel the mental gears turning, right? But here is the kicker. System 2 is inherently lazy. It takes a ton of energy to run, so it often just kicks back and lets System 1 take the wheel, even when System 1 is clearly making mistakes. So the crucial point underlying so much of our irrationality is something Kahneman cleverly calls YSIAT. What you see is all there is. This is a massive cognitive blind spot for us. When your mind is trying to make a decision, it primarily deals only with known observations. It completely ignores complexity, it ignores the role of random chance, and it rarely, if ever, considers the unknown unknowns, the things you don't even know that you don't know. Because your brain just uses the limited information directly in front of it to build a cohesive story, we end up suffering from pervasive, unwarranted overconfidence. We really think we understand the world much better than we actually do. Moving on to Section 2, Mental Shortcuts and Biases, Your Predictable Errors. Was Mahatma Gandhi more than 114 years old when he died? Now, by asking you this incredibly bizarre question, I am deliberately triggering what's known as the anchoring effect. If I were to then ask you to estimate Gandhi's actual age at death, your System 1 is going to be heavily and unconsciously influenced by that completely irrelevant number of 114. Studies consistently show that people presented with a high anchor like this will guess a much higher age of death than people who were first asked if he was, say, 35 years old. Your brain just latches onto the very first number it sees and adjusts from there, even if that number is totally meaningless. This underlying inability to think statistically is perfectly exposed by the famous Linda problem. In this experiment, Kahneman and Tversky described a fictional woman named Linda. They said she was young, outspoken, intelligent, and deeply concerned with social justice and discrimination. Then they asked a simple question. Is it more probable that Linda is a bank teller or that she is a bank teller and an active feminist? Overwhelmingly, people guessed the latter. But mathematically, that completely violates the laws of probability. I mean, all feminist bank tellers are by definition bank tellers. Therefore, being just a bank teller is always statistically more likely. So why do we get this so wrong? Because our lazy System 2 tags out, and System 1 substitutes a very difficult statistical question with a much easier stereotypical one. Does Linda look like a feminist? And hey, if you think these biases only apply to tricky little logic puzzles, consider this staggering discrepancy. The average American kitchen remodel in 2002 was expected to cost around $18,000, but the actual cost? Nearly $39,000. This perfectly highlights what's called the planning fallacy. It exposes a deeply ingrained optimistic bias inside all of us. We systematically overestimate the benefits of our plans and completely underestimate the costs and the time required to pull them off. We suffer from this illusion of control, just assuming our risky projects will go exactly as planned, while totally ignoring all the historical data that proves otherwise. Which brings us to Section 3, Understanding Prospect Theory, Economics Meets Psychology.
Before Kahneman came along, traditional expected utility theory basically assumed humans were totally rational actors who just coldly calculated the absolute best financial outcome. But prospect theory argues something totally different. We don't just objectively calculate ultimate utility. When making choices under uncertainty, we actually go through two distinct phases. First up is the editing phase, where we collect info, code it, and set a subjective reference point. We aren't looking at absolute wealth here, we're looking at the change in wealth from exactly where we currently stand. Then we enter the evaluation phase, where we make our choices based solely on that new, subjective, edited framework.
And this leads us to the absolute core of the theory. If you look closely at this S-shaped value function curve, the center point represents our reference point. While the curve goes up to the right for gains, notice how the left side for losses is visibly steeper. This curve visually proves that humans suffer from loss aversion. To put it as simply as possible, losing hurts us far more than winning feels good. We are incredibly sensitive to losses relative to our reference point. In fact, we will take wildly irrational risks just to avoid a loss, even if the strict mathematical probability says we absolutely shouldn't. To really see how this affects life or death decisions, consider these two scenarios. Scenario A is a surgery with a 90% survival rate. Scenario B is a surgery with a 10% mortality rate. Mathematically, these are identical scenarios, right? But thanks to the framing effect tied to prospect theory, patients, and surprisingly, even trained doctors, are overwhelmingly more likely to accept the procedure when it's framed as a 90% survival rate. The sheer context in which a choice is presented drastically alters our perception of the risk, entirely bypassing our logical system too.
All right, Section 4, the two selves, how we remember our lives.
Kahneman had this shocking realization that when it comes to measuring our own well-being, we actually have two distinct selves. The experiencing self lives purely in the present moment, answering the immediate question, how does it feel right now? But the remembering self is the one that actually keeps score, answering the question, how was it on the whole? Here is the huge takeaway. The experiencing self is essentially a stranger to us. We are ruled entirely by our remembering self. And the remembering self suffers from what's called the peak end rule. It completely ignores the duration of a pleasant or painful event. Instead, it rates an experience retrospectively based almost entirely on its most intense peak and how the whole thing concluded. Finally, we reach Section 5, the replication crisis, a humbling twist. So in recent years, the entire field of psychology went through this massive replication crisis, where scientists found they simply could not reproduce the results of many famous foundational studies. Researchers specifically went back and analyzed the priming studies that Kahneman heavily cited in his chapter on the associative machine. They calculated the replicability index, which is a measure of scientific reliability, for these specific studies. And the result? A truly dismal 14. This indicates essentially low to almost zero scientific reliability for those findings. Practically overnight, the foundation of that specific chapter was suddenly incredibly shaky. But this builds to a memorable and incredibly humbling narrative climax. Rather than getting defensive, Daniel Kahneman actually publicly admitted his mistake, stating, "I placed too much faith in underpowered studies." Think about that. The man who literally won a Nobel Prize for discovering cognitive biases realized he had succumbed to the very same YUCIASIT, what you see is all there is, and the very same optimistic biases that he spent his entire career identifying in other people. He looked at studies with small sample sizes, he saw a pattern he liked, and his own System 1 just jumped right to a conclusion. To wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with this provocative thought. If the Nobel laureate who literally mapped human irrationality can fall victim to his own mental shortcuts, what unknown biases are secretly shaping your decisions right this very second? Look, we can't turn off our System 1. It is absolutely essential for our daily survival. But now that you understand the illusion of your own rationality and the predictable traps your mind sets for you, how will you use your deliberate, logical System 2 to hit pause, question your framing, and ultimately make better decisions tomorrow?